And he began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious word that came from his lips. "Isn't this Joseph's son?" they asked. Jesus said to them, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself. Do here in your hometown what we have heard that you did in Capernaum.' I tell you the truth," he continued. "No prophet is accepted in his own hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet. Yet none of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian." All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, they drove him out of town, they took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him down over the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. This is the word of the Lord. So shortly after I started my contract at St. Stephen's University, I was tasked with buying books for their library. The aim was to infuse the library with Indigenous books, both those that had Indigenous authors, but also those that spoke to the emerging Indigenous Academy. It was a big task to choose the right books that would be within budget, provide a variety of topics for the various different majors, etc. One of the other criteria was to try to find books that were written by Wabanaki authors, or were about the Wabanaki peoples, those being the Mi'kmaq, the Wolastoqiyik, the Passamaquoddy, the Penobscot, and the Abenaki. To help with that task, I borrowed some books from the public library to read some of what I might eventually purchase. Early that May, as I was flying to Winnipeg for a United for Mining Justice Network gathering, on the plane, I started to read Pam Palmater's book, Beyond Blood. Dr. Pam Palmater is a Mi'kmaq lawyer. She's a member of the Eel River Bar Band First Nation of Northern New Brunswick. She's a professor of Indigenous law at Ryerson University. She ran in the election for the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations in 2012. She was outspoken and helped organize during the Idle No More movement. And she's a frequent commentator on CBC on any news items that intersect with Indigenous governance, women, or children. In her book, Beyond Blood, she chronicles the long-term effects that the law and policy that have had of the Indian Act's definition of status. It was a dense and informative read, but unlike many in academia, Dr. Palmater interwove her own personal narrative throughout the explanation of the law. From 1869 to 1985, the Indian Act did not allow Indigenous women who married non-Indigenous men to pass their status on to their children. In fact, they lost their status as soon as they were married. In 1985, amendments were made that allowed women to start to reclaim their status. Pam Palmater was one of those women. However, under the current system, these women are classified differently than those who have maintained their status throughout history. And so their children inherit an inferior level of status that is not allowed to be passed on. This new lesser classification is also being applied a generation later to all Indigenous peoples who have always had their status. So in Dr. Palmater's estimation, it will lead to there being no status Indigenous people in Canada within a mere generations. For an idea of how widespread the issue is, the St. Mary's band membership in Fredericton is almost 50% of this lesser status, which means that half of the band will be unable to pass their status on to the next generation unless they choose to procreate with a status Indigenous person. But I remember what struck me the most was Dr. Palmater's stories about her children who couldn't participate in culture or language activities that were offered on reserve, as their family lived off reserve and she did not have status, and they did not have status. One of the aspects that she documented so highly was that because the federal funding for reserves is attached to status, there is widespread discrimination against non-stative Native people. Bands cannot afford to provide them with services such as cultural experiences, so they choose to ostracize them from the community. It's a lateral violence that divides Indigenous communities into on and off reserve and status and non-status Natives. Many band membership policies restrict membership to only status Indigenous peoples. At the time, I remember thinking what a privilege it was to have such a competent and passionate woman as part of the Mi'kmaq Nation. Fast forward to this fall, when I made the mistake of reading the comment section on a CDC article in which Dr. Pam Palmer was quoted and referenced, and the discrimination that she wrote about as to being so rampant in Indigenous communities was on full display. There were comments that said she wasn't really a Mi'kmaq because she'd only been registered after 1985. There were comments that she was never home and she'd been living in Toronto for so long that she was completely out of touch. There were comments that she had never lived on the Eel River Bar First Nation Reserve, and so she wasn't a real Native. Heartbreaking comments, because Dr. Palmer is a well-respected scholar, an author, and lawyer who's dedicated her entire life's work to the reform of the Indian Act. Heartbreaking comments because it's Dr. Palmer who we so often hear speak to the injustices suffered by Indigenous communities, and yet there are those in her own community who would reject her. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but a widow in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. These are the other examples that Jesus gives us in our gospel of the ones who spoke out and had to leave their hometowns in order to be heard. Ones that history respects, but those who watched them grow cannot fathom that the carpenter's son or the young boy or the off-reserve person would have anything eloquent or important to offer. For the people of Nazareth in Jesus' time, it's difficult to hear the news that it's often these others that are more accepting of God's word than the faithful. It's difficult to hear that God speaks to everyone, but it might be us, the ones who are in the pews week after week, who might struggle to hear it. Similarly, when we hear the words about love in Corinth, our mind probably goes to weddings. Love is awesome, right? The people who were reading this letter and it was addressed to them are struggling to love one another. Based on the words written, we can gather that the Corinthians are struggling with envy, boasting, shame, self-seeking behavior, and those who are delighting in injustice. They are being called upon to restructure their community into one of love. But unlike a Disney fairy tale or a romantic comedy, love is difficult. Love is not easy. Love is hard work. It means continually being humble, trying to be empathetic, attempting to be authentic with another person even when it leaves us vulnerable. Love is a tightrope walk between accepting someone as they are and supporting and encouraging them to become the best they can be. It's loving yourself enough to say no and loving others enough to say yes. It's not easy. And as the epistle lets us know, churches have always struggled with how to love well. But at the end of the day, the good news is not really all that great without the love. For God so loved the world. Remember? Perhaps one of the most difficult things that love calls on us to do is it requires us to speak. I was on that plane going to Winnipeg that spring day for a meeting of the United for Mining Justice Network. It's a network of people across the church who have knowledge of and speak out against unjust mining practices. In particular, the injustices that are perpetrated by Canadian mining companies around the world. It's something that I speak about often, which you may have noticed, but it's something that sometimes creates waves for me. Just last week, the new Office of Vocations Personnel for Atlantic Canada was trying to track me down as a candidate. And in an email, he said that he was looking forward to meeting me. And my reply was, "You've met me multiple times, but I think you might just know me as the mining girl." And the email back confirmed, "Oh yes, you're right, I do know you." It's a reputation for speaking out that is better known than even my own name. I'm flying to Winnipeg. It means that I'm flying to Winnipeg instead of taking that weekend off. It often means I'm calling out hypocrisy in our structures, calling on our church over and over again to be better, meeting with our MP or writing ministers and calling on our country to be better. It means I'm ruining Canada Day celebrations by pointing out all the negative effects our policies are having both inside and outside the country. It's tough. And I can tell you on one or more occasions I've thought to myself, if I could just be quiet and get along and stop making all of these waves for myself. Yet I know that I have a privilege to speak. I have a captive audience, or at least I thought I did, until I told you I was going to record you. And you're like, well, now we have to pay attention. Anyways, I have a captive audience each week, and I have the ability to go to meetings and hear stories from elsewhere and then bring them back and tell them. I can read those dense academic works of Dr. Pam Palmer, and then I can tell you about it. Similarly, I can read the environmental assessment reports for a mining project and point out what's missing, but also explain what it does say. So more often than not, and at my own peril, I do speak. I do advocate out of love for all of you, out of love for all the others, the temporary foreign workers, the refugee, the Indigenous person of Canada, Guatemala, the Philippines, the homeless, the addicted, the hungry, the marginalized other that you may never see here, but who the church should also love as its neighbor. What we hear in God's words to Jeremiah is a reaffirmation that God does not pick perfect people to speak his words to the world. It does not matter to God that Jeremiah is young or inexperienced. God needs someone to speak, and so Jeremiah is that person. And Jeremiah's job is going to be particularly difficult. He's being asked to deconstruct the reality of the social structures of his time and to reconstruct them according to God's justice and mercy and love. And to do so is going to require Jeremiah to speak words that are going to make people very angry. He's going to be calling upon people to change. Jeremiah is assured by the divine that God will be with him every step of the way. And this is our assurance as well. We are called upon to love. We are called upon to speak that love into the universe and into all of our meetings, to the kitchen table conversations and to the Lions Clubs and the Legions and the Bible studies and into all of our spaces. As a people of God, we're being asked to love without caveat, and we're being asked to speak truth to power and to deconstruct rather than uphold those systems that hurt other people. And for us, that might mean giving up some of the power that we've historically had, and it might mean belonging to a church that isn't always popular with government or even with the other churches in town. It might mean tough conversations and disagreements. But done in love, even these conflicts will move us closer to God. So love loudly, my friends. Speak up, say something, use your voice to make the world a little better each day. And know that when the pit at the bottom of your stomach forms and you know that you should say something, God is with you that day and always. Amen. So, what did we decide to sing?
671.
671. Very good. Number 671, I need thee every hour.